Stories from the East and West. Hi, I'm John.
And I'm Nitan, and this is Stories from the East and West, the podcast revealing histories from the heart of Europe that you never knew had changed our world.
To start off today's story, we want to play you something.
Believe it or not, but that was a human voice.
Recorded in 1961.
And turned into an ultra-avant-garde piece of electronic music.
It was made in a time and place where jazz music had been officially banned for a few years.
Where a ruling communist regime treated any form of abstract art as useless or dangerous.
It was also a time when being an electronic music producer required a sharp pair of scissors and a lot of glue.
So stick around to enter the strange and turbulent world of electronic music before the arrival of techno. We'll tell you a story full of passion,
persistence,
politics,
and some of the most surprising sounds you'll ever hear. On today's Stories from the East and West, we'll be talking about the Polish Radio Experimental Studio, a place that took the ideas at the birth of electronic music and ran with them to become an influential musical powerhouse.
And it did all this despite being under a communist regime that had banned certain kinds of music.
So, how did this all happen?
These days, electronic music is pretty much everywhere. All over the world right now, bedroom DJs are mixing their own beats and samples at home, and clubbers are dancing to extremely loud electronic bass lines until the early hours.
But this wasn't always the case. For a long time, electronic music used to be something created in dark rooms by obsessive technicians fiddling with analog tape mixers, sine wave generators, and oscillators.
Let's go back to where the whole thing started, Paris in the late 1940s.
Now, you might think that this is just a bunch of trains, but you're actually listening to an important milestone in musical history.
In 1948, Pierre Schaeffer recorded Étude au chemin de fer using a series of connected gramophones, one which played sounds back and the other which recorded.
He took recordings of trains and then looped them, and then slowed them down and manipulated them in various ways to create something new.
The French artists developed what you could call a new kind of music, the musique concrète. Music that used concrete sounds, snippets, not abstract notes, as a starting point.
That was Antony Bekshak, music critic and curator.
By using sounds made by everyday objects, such as trains, toys, or pretty much anything, Schaeffer and his collaborators redefined what could be used to create music. He also pretty much invented what is now known as sampling, or using snippets of recorded sound or other people's music. It's a key component of modern electronic and dance music.
It was at Schaeffer's studio d'essai that the development of electro-acoustic music really gained momentum. He'd originally trained as a radio engineer before moving on to musical experimentation and composition, which is kind of relevant to our story. But now, let's peek on the other side of the border.
Yes, let's head to Cologne, Germany for the next important part of our story.
This This is the sound of Studie 1 by the composer Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. It was recorded in 1953 at the Studio for Electronic Music of West German Radio, or WDR for short.
The Cologne studio was taking a very different approach to electroacoustic experimentation. Instead of sampling existing sounds, they were creating electronic ones from scratch using sine wave generators. These generators produced pure tones, which they could then manipulate.
The studio relied on scientific equipment that had actually been designed for testing electronic machinery. Unsurprisingly, the studio resembled a scientific laboratory.
The music produced by composers like Stockhausen was very new and different, and it certainly wasn't to everyone's taste.
Because what was important was that the sounds were very fresh. So you can imagine people got really angry about it, or they got really excited, a few. But definitely it couldn't be treated as something boring and iterative.
A couple years later, and we're in Warsaw in the mid-1950s. For 7 long years, the doctrine of social realism had kept Polish arts under strict control. This included literature, theatre, film, and of course music. It meant that the popular music of the time was simply based around traditional folk songs.
The musicologist Józef Patkowski was working at Polish radio during this period. He had been sent abroad to find new music for their radio dramas. He happened to have a passport, not an easy thing to get under communism.
After visiting various studios in Europe, including the ones in Paris and Cologne, he tried to convince the head of Polish radio, Władysław Sikorski, that they should set up their own electronic music studio in Warsaw.
Now, Sikorski, as the Minister of Culture, would seem a bit crazy to most people today. He actually had banned jazz in the 1940s. Seriously. So, as you can imagine, he wasn't regarded as being particularly progressive.
But surprisingly, he agreed to fund the creation of the new studio. Now, why would somebody who liked banning music suddenly commission a creative space such as this? To try and solve this puzzle, we talked to
Agnieszka Pindera, curator at Muzeum Sztuki in Łódź.
That's the Museum of Art in Łódź.
From what I understand, Włodzimierz Sikorski was really a weird person because he was infamous for the implementation of socialist realism in Poland. But later, when he became a head of the Polish Radio and Television Committee, he was actually the supporter of the foundation, Polish Radio Experimental Studio. He even found money, he found resources to send Józef Patkowski to a trip, sort of survey trip through those first experimental studios, electronic music studios in Europe.
But how did this radical concept fit in with all that state censorship?
The experimental studio at Polish Radio was a product of a very particular moment in Polish history.
David Crowley from the National College of Art and Design in Dublin.
In the second half of the 1950s, Poland went through a really turbulent period after the end of Stalinism, when the state really struggled to maintain control of the country. And it cast Stalinism as a kind of irrational, terrible moment in history, in order really to demonstrate that the new authorities that took control after 1956 were new, rational, scientifically minded politicians. And so they produced a kind of view of the world that said, we are now on a course towards a more rational, progressive future, and we're going to use science and new knowledge in order to get there.
And how did this change in attitude lead to the opening of a new experimental studio in Warsaw?
I think studio was serving as an evidence that we are open after 1956, that we are more open, that our culture is booming. Opening of experimental studio was sort of connected with bringing to life Warsaw Atom International Festival. It was sort of public relations advertisement of this openness.
Set up in 1956, the Warsaw Autumn Festival was the largest festival of contemporary music in Poland, and it still is. For a long time, it was the only place in Central and Eastern Europe where you could come and listen to new work by composers like Igor Stravinsky and John Cage.
Both the Warsaw Autumn Festival and the new experimental studio were meant to be beacons of social progress and openness in an otherwise closed and restrictive system.
But there was also a more practical reason for creating the studio. It was where Polish radio could repair any magnetic tape recordings that were faulty, like if they had crackling or humming or some other glitch.
One of the audio engineers at the studio, Eugeniusz Rudnik, was determined to demonstrate to some visiting communist officials that the studio was capable of amazing technological feats. He wanted to make sure they funded it properly, so he came up with a clever and rather sneaky plan.
He took a recording of classical music that was completely fine to begin with. And then used the studio's equipment to distort it beyond recognition.
Antoni Begsiak gives us the details of this story, told to him by Wojciech Makowski, technical director at Polish Radio.
Eugeniusz Rudnik selected a well-sounding classical music recording, and playing it back from tape, he switched the amplifiers to microphone level, which resulted in overdriving the distinctive croaking. He added 50 Hz hum from a generator and pulled out and pushed in tube amp modules a few times, which produced characteristic thuds.
He played this strange new version to the officials.
The result was grotesque. The original signal was barely breaking through.
Saying he had found a broken recording and that he would now miraculously fix it.
Then he reversed the order
to restore it to its former glory.
And stated, here is the source material, and thanks to our skills and devices, we get this effect. The impression was huge.
Whether or not the story is true, it certainly worked. Józef Patkowski received all the support and funding he needed to make a fully working studio.
But he didn't want to simply copy what the other European studios were doing. He wanted to combine the approaches and methods of Paris and Cologne and create a new kind of multi-purpose facility.
The studio would invite composers from both the Eastern Bloc and the West and be a kind of window to the world.
In order to try and achieve his vision, Patkowski decided that the studio would avoid hiring its own composers, a completely different setup from the other European studios, as Agnieszka Pindera explains.
The idea for the studio from the very beginning was that there is no composer who is hired there permanently. There is no one who would dictate sort of music that is being produced there. That studio in Warsaw will be open to every single musical form and trends and so on.
Instead, the experimental studio would just have its own specialist sound engineers. They were meant to assist visiting composers, physically handling the equipment and getting the final versions of their pieces down on tape.
The first engineer they hired was the previously mentioned Eugeniusz Rudnik. He came from a small village northeast of Warsaw and had no musical background or training. In fact, he got into a bit of trouble as a young man. He was sentenced to spend 2 years working in a coal mine after he attacked his instructor at the Army Technical College he was attending.
Eventually, he found a job at Polish Radio looking after the work of plumbers and electricians. Later, he started working as an audio technician, and then with Patkowski at his new experimental studio.
A few years later, a second engineer, Bohdan Mazurek, was hired. Later on, both Mazurek and Rudnik would outgrow their original roles in ways that no one could have imagined, but more about that later.
In 1959, the composer Włodzimierz Kotoński, working with Eugeniusz Rudnik, produced the first original piece recorded at the Polish Radio experimental studio, Étude concrète, Study for One Cymbal Stroke.
To create the track, Kotoński and Rudnik used a recorded sample of a cymbal being hit. Something like this.
They produced the piece according to a set of predetermined rules and mathematical ratios which determine the pitch and length of each sound. The organic sound of the cymbal had become something completely alien.
The thing is, nobody could really say what an electronic composition sounded like until the final piece was put down on magnetic tape. This fact meant that the technicians undertook the actual execution of the composer's ideas, and they had to make crucial technical and creative decisions.
This composer-producer duality would become the defining feature of the studio. It also meant that in some instances, the same composition could be performed or recorded in a number of different ways by different sound engineers and different equipment.
The main medium of the studio was magnetic tape. Tape had to be cut, labeled, sorted, and glued back together to create a single fragment of music. This process would be repeated again and again and again and again until the desired effects were achieved.
Obviously, this was a far more labor-intensive process than what today's computer-based production allows. These tracks would literally take hundreds of hours to make.
But for Eugeniusz Rudnik, the studio's main sound engineer doing all of this physical work, all this time spent was worth it. Magnetic tape as a medium for capturing and holding sound was fascinating to him, even magical.
Dźwięk został zapisany, utrwalony na taśmie magnetofonowej.
Sound was recorded on magnetic tape. I became obsessed with the physicality of this tape, and suddenly I held sound in my hand.
Trzymałem w ręce dźwięk.
Rudnik and Mazurek were now creating exciting and original electronic music with some of the best composers of the era. For example, Krzysztof Penderecki worked with Mazurek on the soundtrack to the cult film The Saragossa Manuscript. Having spent literally hundreds of hours in the studio with these brilliant musical minds, in hindsight it seems unsurprising that Rudnik and Mazurek started to create compositions of their own.
Possibly because they were spending so much time in the studio, cutting and gluing all those tapes and working with the composers. At the beginning, composers only from Poland, then foreign composers from all over the world. And they started composing themselves, and actually very quickly they became really good at it.
Rudnik would often use discarded sound materials from the various Polish radio studios. He liked using outtakes and mistakes as raw material to manipulate. He was particularly interested in the qualities of the human voice and how, through repetition and manipulation, it could be perceived in a completely new way.
Here's Rudnik describing his fascination in the film 15 Corners of the World.
Wsłuchując się w sposób chorobliwy, perwersyjny, w x razy w to jedno słowo, tak jakby...
When I listen pathologically, perversely to a single word X number of times, I noticed hesitation in that sound that one wouldn't normally hear.
Jakby poznaję głębiej tego człowieka, że gdybym nie miał...
I comprehend that person on a deeper level. If not for the medium of recorded sound and my interest in this phenomenon as an object to be turned into my art, I wouldn't have the chance to think about it at all.
To bym nie miał szansy tak się nad tym w ogóle zastanawiać.
Eventually, Rudnik began to win important international awards.
His music was played at festivals and radio stations all over the world,
as well as at prestigious venues such as Carnegie Hall.
His passion for experimentation granted him, a former coal mine prisoner from a small village, a respected position in the lofty and ultimately posh world of contemporary classical music.
And he achieved all this despite originally being hired to assist composers with technical issues.
Rudnik himself was somewhat amused by the fame and status he had achieved. Having had no musical training, being a world-renowned composer was the last thing he had expected.
But Rudnik's development as a composer may have caused tension with the director, Józef Patkowski.
It could be a problem.
Patkowski's original idea for the studio was that there shouldn't be any permanent composers who might end up influencing the artistic direction of the studio.
Rudnik wanted to be more than this advisor, this assistant for a composer. He wanted to compose himself. But we have evidences for both. We have evidences Patkowski was supporting Rudnik in his creative process, but at the same time, until some extent, annoyed with this development more into creation and being less and less interested in being support.
Despite these successes and its growing international reputation, the experimental studio would soon face a major existential challenge. Indeed, the situation of both the studio and the entire country would change drastically on December 13th, 1981.
Ogłaszam, że w dniu dzisiejszym ukonstytuowała się Wojskowa Rada Ocalenia Narodowego.
I announced today a military council of national salvation was formed. The National Council, in accordance with the provisions of the Constitution, will introduce today at midnight martial law throughout the country.
The introduction of martial law was one of the darkest chapters in Poland's post-war history. It brought with it the widespread suppression of civil rights and artistic freedoms.
That was the moment that no one could access buildings of the radio, that everything was really shut down for a longer period of time.
Agnieszka Pindera describes what things were like at the experimental studio.
From what we hear now from people that remembered, it was very depressing. They had no idea how long it will take. They couldn't work. They had no idea when they will be able to go back.
Crucially, the director of the studio, Józef Patkowski, suddenly found himself in trouble.
He was present at one of the meetings with state officials, and he said that Poland is this cultural desert, and it was never forgotten. He stopped having this immunity of a sort, and then he got fired.
Other directors were hired, with Krzysztof Szlifirski eventually taking over as the final director of the studio.
Recording activity was suspended for a number of years, and the experimental studio was ultimately moved to a different building.
Polish Experimental Studio was moved to the other space on Woronicza Street.
Paweł Nowożycki from the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw explains.
Then they get 3 rooms, which were basic control rooms of the radio, so they didn't have any special design, and
the changes brought about by those dark years of martial law started the gradual decline of the experimental studio. Despite various technological updates, such as the arrival of digital synthesizers and computer-based recording facilities, things were never the same.
The studio somehow managed to survive the end of communism and continued into the 1990s, but it was producing fewer and fewer original pieces. Elsewhere, the world of music production was busy changing radically, as Antoni Beksiak explains.
For electronic music, it was a time of change to home or bedroom studios, and creators became meaningfully independent from institutions.
All of this meant that the experimental studio lost its important role as a musical laboratory and a meeting place for creative minds. Agnieszka Pindera again.
Finally, after year 2000, studio had less and less finances. They could produce less and less.
The end really seemed to be in sight.
Now studio doesn't exist anymore, but there is still one person at the Polish radio that is some sort of custodian of this oeuvre.
Eugeniusz Rudnik even composed a piece about the slow death of the studio, which he called Pastoral Agony. Rudnik's story shows us how someone with very humble beginnings and pretty much no musical knowledge can become a world-famous composer through persistence and a passion for electronic music.
So in a way, you could say Rudnik was the forefather of today's bedroom producers, who, without attending music school, spend hours fiddling on their laptops. Just like Rudnik, some of them suddenly find themselves world famous.
Of course, these days, the internet has made achieving fame potentially a lot easier, or at least much quicker than in Rudnik's case.
It also shows what a contradiction living under communism was. You had all these severe restrictions on creativity and freedom of speech, and yet in this sea of censorship, there were these small pockets of intense creativity and original experimentation.
But you couldn't escape the whims and temperaments of the authoritarian regime, which at one point could effectively ban jazz and electronic music, to only actively support them a few years later.
There is this legend that Sikorski said at some point that the thing that he was supporter of the experimental studio is some sort of payback for what he did before. So it was some sort of payback for socialist realism on his side.
By the early 2000s, when the experimental studio had closed down for good, it seemed destined to end up in the dustbin of history.
And this almost certainly would have been the case had it not been for the efforts of musician and musicologist Bolesław Błaszczyk. He befriended Eugeniusz Rudnik and started to organize a catalog of his work.
In 2009, a compilation of Rudnik's work selected by Błaszczyk became popular among contemporary electronic musicians, perhaps as part of the nostalgia that had caused vinyl to experience a resurgence.
This was followed by the release of a new work from Rudnik in 2014, entitled Erdada on Tape. Yes, despite being well into his 80s, he had finally released his first album.
Eugeniusz Rudnik passed away 2 years later in 2016, but by this time he had become a genuine cult icon in the music world, and his work continues to reach an ever-increasing audience.
But what about the Black Room, the studio's revolutionary recording space? Is it really lost forever? Well, maybe not quite.
The Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw is currently planning to rebuild the Black Room within their new museum building. We talked to Paweł Nowożycki about the project.
Yeah, what we're trying to do is to reconstruct the historical interior and to collect the remaining historical equipment and make it working again, and to buy new digital equipment to make it useful for contemporary musicians and composers working in the digital studios too. During the day it will function as an exhibition, so people can come in, see how it looked like, touch the objects, maybe even make some basic sounds. But then we also want to develop a program of residencies, to invite artists to work in the studio, to commission the new works from them, which then we will present to the public in the cinema space on our new auditorium.
This episode of Stories from the East and West was a Wire Walker studio production for Culture.pl. Our team included Wojciech Oleksiak, Adam Żuławski, John Beecham, Nitzan Reisner and Piotr Wołoczko. A big thanks to Antoni Beksiak, Agnieszka Pindera, Paweł Nowożycki and David Crowley for joining us on this episode. Also, our thanks go out to Łukasz Truszyński from the Adam Mickiewicz Institute for his help. To see the notes from this episode, just tap the show art in your podcast app or visit storiesfromtheeastandwest.com. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to subscribe for future episodes. And remember to give us a review on Apple Podcasts. It'll help others find the podcast too.